It's great to be back in Arkansas, particularly in Little Rock. I was at Hendrix yesterday, where I graduated in 1986, and had a wonderful day of talking to students and old friends. And then I just finished having lunch with some of the students here at the Clinton School. And again, I'm struck by the wonderful things that can happen in Arkansas. Thanks as well to Skip Rutherford and Jay Barth and others here in the Clinton School and the library who are involved in bringing me here. I was thinking last night, there was actually a reception here last night associated with some of the Hendrix events, and when we came into the parking lot, I was trying to get my memory around this building that we're in, and I finally placed it, that when I lived on 8th Street long ago, there was a giant warehouse bar several blocks that direction. And I was constantly going there for some reason, usually in the dark. And there was this crazy derelict train station, over here somewhere. And I was always perplexed by why that was there and what it was. And now, now here we are. I would have never imagined. It's also special to me to get to talk about this work, some of my recent work in Little Rock, because I did begin my career here many thousands of articles ago. And I was just telling the students that, and that's why he corrected himself during the introduction, that I did not work at the Democrat Gazette. I was part of the mongrel horde at the Democrat that destroyed the Arkansas Gazette. Which that's competition. There should have been more competition in my business, and perhaps in the past, and maybe it wouldn't be in such an apocalyptic state today. It's very special for me to be at the Clinton Library. Now, as you all know, as a journalist, I'm not supposed to make my political preferences too obvious, and sometimes my personal preferences go counter to what one might assume around any of this. But I will tell you that growing up in the Mississippi Delta, on the Mississippi side of the river, and then moving back to Arkansas in high school, KATV back then had that giant tower somewhere. It was like the tallest tower in America. And so even in Mississippi, out in the Delta, that was the only really good signal you could get for many years. Right, Mom? My mother's here, by the way. At least that's how I remember it. And I would come home from school every day and turn on KATV and watch 2 consecutive episodes of the Andy Griffith Show. I still remember that. I came to where I I could quote every episode of the Andy Griffith Show after the years were over. And so I followed the Razorbacks, and because I've been born in Arkansas and had some association with it, only person in my family born in Arkansas, even in all those years growing up in Mississippi, I always had this interest in this TV station and in this guy who began to be on that TV station all the time, Bill Clinton. I used to refer to it as growing up Bill, sort of just following this extraordinary figure. And then finally, when we finally moved back to Arkansas, I remember, I doubt this was the first time that I met President Clinton, or then ex-Governor Clinton at the time, actually, but I attended the Arkansas Governor's School, which was actually how I was introduced to Hendrix College, which also became a sort of transforming thing for me. So I went, the same summer, though, that I went to the Governor's School, I also went to Boyd State. And it was during the interregnum, the Frank White interregnum. Wasn't that right? Frank White, yeah. But ex-Governor Clinton came to speak at Boyd State, and the night before he came, I stayed up late and I made a sign, a handmade sign that said something like, because he hadn't yet said whether or not he was going to run again, though obviously he was. And I made the sign that said, Governor Bill Clinton in 1982 or 83, whatever it would have been. And then I got early to the auditorium and got a seat at the very front. And there were 2 aisles. I remember doing the sort of math of this, and I was sort of trying, which aisle is he going to come down when he walks down to take the stage? And so I bet on one side and got a seat at the very front. And when he arrived, and then he came down my aisle, and I stood up on the chair and held my sign up, And Bill Clinton stopped and shook my hand and afterwards talked to me for a few minutes and signed my sign, which I still have, actually. So I became a big fan of Bill Clinton. And many times after that, of course, usually as a reporter in various ways, and continued my interest in the guy, debated briefly becoming part of his first campaign, actually, and then decided I should stick with guaranteed work. Though now that seems a less certain thing in journalism. But I will just say that it's become sort of de rigueur in cynical American talk that whenever we discuss a political figure who we admire, we're supposed to at the same time say something about them that also disappoints us. I'm not going to do that because I can say without reservation that President Clinton, his optimism, his intellectual rigor, just the way in which his life demonstrated that a person from extraordinarily humble circumstances could in fact accomplish so much for so many people, as I think is evidenced by just the fact that we're here today, I think is an extraordinary thing, and I view him as a personal hero. It's also great to be at a school that is about public service, and I'm flattered that I was referred to as a public servant coming up here. That's not always the way that people think of journalists, but I do. Though journalists are often confused about that, we're actually sort of schizophrenic about what our role in society is. Is it to afflict or to comfort, and who exactly are we supposed to be afflicting and comforting at various times? Those are all confusing questions, but I'm very committed to the idea that at the heart of almost all public service is a quest for the truth, a quest for a clinical and defensible version of the truth and a reality and understanding of who we are and how we got where we are. I think that's absolutely critical to every kind of public service, and that's the kind of public service that I have tried to perform in my work as a journalist, and I commend everyone here and the students I was just talking to who are beginning a life pursuing that same thing. But so, with that, maybe I should actually tell you a little bit about why I'm here, why you're here, that being my book, Slavery by Another Name, The Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. Since the book came out, I have talked to a lot of people around the country, and I've finally come to terms with a harsh reality, and that is that not everyone in America has yet completed my book. So I won't assume that you've all read it. But I'll tell you a little bit about it, and I'll tell you a little bit about why I wrote it, and in the course of that, a little more about who I am, perhaps, and then try to take some questions, because that's always more interesting than whatever I have to say. But why don't I just first read something very short from the very beginning of the book, for those very few of you who have not. But this is from the introduction, and the title of the introduction is "The Bricks We Stand On," and that's a reference to Atlanta. Actually, the specific reference is about Atlanta, where I live in a neighborhood in downtown Atlanta, one of the oldest sections of the city, in a house that was built in 1906. And Atlanta was a place that, as you all know, destroyed in the Civil War. But afterwards, there was in the 1880s and 1890s, there was a brick factory started on the outskirts of Atlanta called Chattahoochee Brick, right on the Chattahoochee River, where there were big deposits of clay. And for about 50 years, Chattahoochee Brick was the supplier of bricks for the reconstruction of the city of Atlanta and then the growth of the city of Atlanta. And there's no doubt that the bricks in my house and the chimneys and the foundations came from Chattahoochee Brick. And the city of Atlanta bought hundreds of millions of bricks over the course of those decades from this company. And those bricks lined the streets of the city. They lined the sidewalks, even still, in my neighborhood. And so the bricks of Chattahoochee Brick are everywhere. They are literally the bricks we stand on. And all of those bricks were made in the late 19th century and deep into the 20th century. All of those bricks were made by slaves. Long after slavery was supposed to have ended, they were made by slaves. And this book is really the story of how that happened. And so this is The Bricks We Stand On. On March 30th, 1908, Green Cottonham was arrested by the sheriff of Shelby County, Alabama, and charged with vagrancy. Cottenham had committed no true crime. Vagrancy, the offense of a person not being able to prove at a given moment that he or she is employed, was a new and flimsy concoction, dredged up from legal obscurity at the end of the 19th century by the state legislatures of Alabama and every other southern state. It was capriciously enforced by local sheriffs and constables, adjudicated by mayors and notaries public, recorded haphazardly or not at all in court records, and most tellingly, in a time of massive unemployment among all Southern men, was reserved almost exclusively for black men. Cottenham's true offense was blackness. After 3 days behind bars, the 22-year-old man was found guilty in a swift appearance before the county judge and immediately sentenced to a 30-day term of hard labor. Unable to pay the array of fees assessed on every prisoner, fees to the sheriff, the deputy, the court clerk, the witnesses, Cottenham's sentence was extended to nearly a year of hard labor. The next day, the man, the youngest of 9 children born to former slaves in an adjoining county, was sold. Under a standing arrangement between the county and a vast subsidiary of the industrial titan of the North, U.S. Steel Corporation, the sheriff turned the young man over to the company for the duration of his sentence. In return, the subsidiary gave the county $12 a month to pay off Cottenham's fines and fees. What the company's managers did with Cottenham and thousands of other black men they purchased from sheriffs across Alabama was entirely up to them. A few hours later, the company plunged Cottenham into the darkness of a mine called Slope Number 12, one shaft in a vast subterranean labyrinth on the edge of Birmingham known as the Pratt Mines. There, he was chained inside a long wooden barrack at night and required to spend nearly every waking hour digging and loading coal. His required daily task was to remove 8 tons of coal from the mine. Cottenham was subject to the whip for failure to dig the requisite amount, at risk of physical torture for disobedience, and vulnerable to the predations of other miners, many of whom already had passed years or decades in their own Chthonian confinement. The lightless catacombs of black rock, packed with hundreds of desperate men, slick with sweat and coated in pulverized coal, must have exceeded any vision of hell a boy born in the countryside of Alabama, even a child of slaves, could have ever imagined. Waves of disease ripped through the population. In the month before Cottenham arrived at the prison mine, pneumonia and tuberculosis sickened dozens. Within his first 4 weeks, 6 died. Before the year was over, almost 60 men forced into Slope 12 were dead of disease, accidents, or homicide. Most of the broken bodies, along with hundreds of others before and after, were dumped into shallow graves scattered among the refuse of the mine. Others were incinerated in nearby ovens used to blast millions of tons of coal brought to the surface into coke, the carbon-rich fuel essential to U.S. Steel's production of iron. 45 years after Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation freeing American slaves, Green Cottenham and more than 1,000 other men, black men, toiled under the lash at Slope 12. Imprisoned in what was then the most advanced city of the South, guarded by whipping bosses employed by the most iconic example of the modern corporation emerging in the Gilded North, there were slaves in all but name. That's essentially the story of this book and of how it came to pass that at the end of the Civil War, with the South essentially addicted to slavery, economically and intellectually addicted to slavery, unable to rehabilitate itself or restart its economy in any meaningful way, how the white South was compelled to resurrect a form of slavery, what I call neo-slavery. And not just through the criminal justice system, but by many, many means, but using the criminal justice system as a hammer of coercion that forced enormous numbers of African-American men, primarily, back into some sort of involuntary servitude as a result of this economic addiction to slavery that the South had, and also its compelling need on the political front to force African Americans out of the political process and crush black aspiration, both politically and economically. The book is the story of how that happened, how this new kind of slavery was resurrected, the laws that were passed in the 1880s and 1890s primarily, which effectively criminalized black life, created a web of legal jeopardy that almost no black man in the South could avoid. Laws that made it a crime, obviously, vagrancy was a crime. If one could not prove that you had work at any time, that was a criminal offense. It was also a criminal offense For a black man to speak loudly in the company of a white woman, it was certainly it was a criminal offense for there to be sexual relations between blacks and whites. But it was also a crime in the South for any farm laborer to seek employment from a landowner without first getting permission from the landowner that he already worked for. That was a crime in the South, to seek a different job. Now that was the law, that law and all the rest of these laws didn't say that it applied only to African Americans, but overwhelmingly these laws were only ever enforced against African Americans, and they were almost never enforced except in circumstances where the explicit intent was to force large numbers of African American men back into some kind of coerced labor. And this system that emerged by the end of the 19th century happened at a time when almost no whites in the South had any reservations about that this was something that ought to be happening or that whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. Very few people had any misgivings about this in the South, and in fact, almost no whites in the North had any misgivings about this. In the conventional telling of the history, we focus on the creation of the NAACP almost exactly 100 years ago by Du Bois and others, and we gravitate to the stories of those who stood against this tide, but the reality is that overwhelmingly, by the beginning of the 20th century, there was no consensus among whites anywhere in America for the citizenship of African Americans. And Du Bois wrote about that eloquently, his incredible sense of despair that the country that had undertaken this extraordinarily noble effort of the Civil War and the ending of slavery had then, in such a short period of time, completely repudiated the moral victory of the Civil War and the terrible consequences of that for African Americans, and in ways that still sculpt our society today. So that's the essence of the book. Now, since it came out, and I've been talking to groups like this around the country, there's a question that keeps coming up. It was coming up before the election a year ago, and even more so after the election, and that is, what's the relevance of all of this now? What's the point of it now? Why should we care about this terribly grim history? And it is a grim, grim story. I think it's a readable book, but it's a very grim, terrible story of what happened, the reality of what happened. And so why does it matter now? Why does it keep coming back? Why does someone like me keep bringing these sorts of things up, especially when we've elected a black president and when we have accomplished as much as we have accomplished in the last 40 years, which, you know, there's a real tendency of progressives to not sufficiently honor what has happened in the last 35 or 40 years. The achievements have been absolutely spectacular. I like to point out that African Americans have probably achieved more in the past 40 years in terms of economic advancement and educational attainment than any identifiable minority, ethnic minority in any society in human history. The speed and scale of what has been accomplished in the last 40 years is absolutely extraordinary. We can't deny all that. So in the context of all that, why does a story like this matter? Why does the past matter at all? And that seemed particularly potent back in January and February and March, when we were all on a high. No matter what our politics were, we were all on a high about the election and the inauguration. The last few months, it hasn't seemed exactly the same way in some quarters, and the relevance of the past in these issues seems to be maybe a little more obvious than it was when I first started talking about it. But I do think it's a big question, and it's a question that is worth pondering, and it's also one that doesn't necessarily have incredibly simple answers. But I call it the persistent past, or the dilemma of the past. But no matter what we do, the past keeps coming back. We keep bumping into the past, no matter how hard we might try not to. In fact, a couple of weeks before the inauguration, I was in Springfield, Illinois, where not the birthplace of Springfield, Illinois, but not the birthplace of President Lincoln, as the first edition of my book said, but the hometown of Abraham Lincoln. There have been 5 small errors I've corrected. That's the virtue of a book that has multiple editions, though. All very minor. I was in Springfield, Illinois, the hometown of Abraham Lincoln. Very important place, stop on the Underground Railway, a town that has all of the associations that you likely might have, if any, would be extraordinarily positive ones in terms of race, and also the place where President Obama announced his candidacy on the steps of the old Illinois State House 2 years before the election, and where he had served as a member of the state legislature. But I was there just before the inauguration, writing a story about a series of events that had occurred in Springfield over the previous year, marking the 100th anniversary of a race riot that occurred in Springfield in 1908, in Springfield, Illinois. And Springfield at that time, in 1908, was the blackest city in Illinois, probably the blackest city in the Midwest, and one of the blackest cities anywhere outside of the South. Because in 1908, it was still the case that the vast, vast, vast majority of all African Americans were still in the Deep South and still in the slave counties. And you had some African Americans in New York and a few other places, but for the most part, there really weren't any black people outside the South, except in a few isolated places. And Springfield, Illinois was the town in the Midwest where there were a fair number of African Americans, and the reason they were there was because it was Abraham Lincoln's hometown, and the association that they had, and there was a vibrant community there with businesses and lots of a very evolved black community. But in 1908, after a series of false allegations, ultimately proven to be false allegations by a white woman that she had been raped by a black man. Long story short, a story you know well, there was an attempt to lynch the black man who was being held in the prison, but when the sheriff successfully spirited him out of town to avoid the lynching, this mob, which had organized itself, ironically, the location they organized themselves was directly across the street from where Barack Obama announced his presidency a century later. This mob went on a rampage for 2 days, and with the intent of driving all African Americans out of Springfield, Illinois. And they were largely successful. And there were a number of black men killed, including one African American man who had known Abraham Lincoln. He had been a cobbler who made shoes for Abraham Lincoln, but then had gone on to have success, as economic success, and had bought property and married a white woman and had biracial children. And the mob specifically went to his house, old man by then, dragged him out into the street, murdered him in his front yard, and then hung him from a tree. And then as the day went by, the mob came back again and cut the tree down and cut it into small pieces for souvenirs. And there's still people in Springfield, Illinois who have some of these souvenirs from 1908. Well, that was an incident in Springfield, Illinois that for decades and decades and decades nobody knew had happened. Somehow, within just a few years after that, the town of Springfield, Illinois just forgot that those events had ever occurred. And then many decades went by where there was no discussion of it. And finally, interestingly enough, as the 200th anniversary of the birth of Lincoln, which is this year, as that date was approaching and Springfield was beginning to prepare for its Lincoln bicentennial celebration, there began to be some voices in the community who said, well, there was this other thing that happened in 1908, and should we really skip to Lincoln's birth, and skip over this thing that happened in 1908? And that led to, for me, a fascinating conversation in that city and community about what to do about this event of 100 years ago that had been suppressed. And so I went to Springfield to write a story about what came out of that conversation and how over the course of a year the town had done a whole series of events, including a reenactment of a trial in which a few of the members of the mob, there'd been an effort to prosecute some members of the mob, though they had all been acquitted. There were speeches made, there were church services between black and white congregations, all of the kinds of things that we think of, that we come up with these days when we're trying to deal with some of these issues, and all of which are extremely difficult to measure whether they add up to anything, whether they really accomplish anything. Like almost everybody's church now, or lots of churches, has a once-a-year joint service with a black congregation or a white congregation from across town. And those are all things that in the moment are powerful for people oftentimes, but then afterwards everybody wonders whether they really add up to anything. Well, I would venture that they do. even when it's not obvious. And that's what had happened in Springfield, was that over the course of this year, a fairly extraordinary thing had happened. And so I went there to write about that story, and then a few days later, I was in Washington getting ready for the inauguration, and I had the incredible good fortune of that on the day of the inauguration, I was there at the base of the podium where the president was taking the oath, and I turned around at one point and looked back across the nearly 2 million people who were on the National Mall, and just that extraordinary, extraordinary scene. I called it in the Journal the next day. I think I'm right about this. I verbosely overwrote it as an undulating, glittering, flag-waving blanket of human optimism. Well, I like it. I like that. Just before that, a day or so before the inauguration, I was at an event in Washington that was hosted by Martin Luther King III. If any of you have been following the travails of the King family in recent years, then there's usually a groan when I make reference to any of the children. Such a complicated story, though Martin, in my view, Martin is the sane one of the King children. And I've gotten to know him pretty well, actually. In fact, he came to my house for the little party we had after the Pulitzer was announced, and so that's why he's the sane one. But Martin actually has after many years of having a lot of trouble finding his way, and you can imagine what the burden is of having the name Martin Luther King. And so for many years, Martin had trouble figuring out what to do with that name and himself. But he finally has begun to figure that out, I think. And he hosted a really remarkable event on the Sunday night before the inauguration in Washington that had almost all of the living legends of the civil rights era were there. Andy Young was there, John Lewis, a whole host of others. And in many respects, it was sort of the standard NAACP awards dinner ritual, kind of rubbery chicken and a gospel choir at the beginning, and then a speech by one of the lions of the movement, about how much is still to be done, and a lot of amens in the crowd. And then a good gospel number at the end, and it was one. I've been to scores of those, and I got up at one point and I walked over to where Andrew Young was sitting, and Andy and I have gotten to know each other pretty well. His office is actually immediately under mine in the same building, and so we see each other a lot. And I walked over and crouched down beside him, and Andy is fading a little bit. His age is finally catching up with him, and all his trips to Africa he keeps making. But I walked over and sort of sat down with him, and we kind of cracked a joke about how this was the sort of a ritualistic event, except that what was so extraordinary about it was that who was there. Everybody who's still alive, who had been anybody, was there, and that was extraordinary. But then he started talking about that that what was also so amazing about it was that everybody for weeks leading up to the inauguration had been saying, all of you had been saying to each other whenever you got in a conversation about how amazing it was that a black man had been elected, whether you were for him or not, but everybody was in one of those conversations, and everybody said, I never imagined this could have happened. We all said that to each other. We never imagined this day would ever come. And some of the speakers that night were even saying, we never imagined this day would come. And Andy started saying, though, but Dr. King did imagine it. Dr. King did. He would have imagined this. And we got in this conversation about the tragedy that he wasn't there. He would be in his early 80s now. He should have been there, should have been a part of that, should have seen this event that he could have imagined, that he did imagine, and that in fact there was this real sense in the room that night that we were at the mountaintop, that we had finally reached this mountaintop, the mountaintop that he had talked about, how much he would have appreciated that. But then Andy and I got in this conversation about the dilemma of the mountaintop, is what to do. What do you do when you get to the top of the mountain? because there's no place to go except back down the mountain. And it's oftentimes so much harder to go down than it was to go up. So much more complicated. The gravity is different. It's so easy to slip on the way down. It's so hard to deal with the fact that you made it to the mountaintop, but others are still on the other side. How to come down from the mountain and figure out how to get others there, figure out which is the next mountain to climb, and how to begin climbing that mountain. So it was a fascinating conversation, a fascinating time with Andy Young that I think underscores this whole question of what do we do? And I think now we've experienced, since the inauguration, we've experienced that coming down from the mountaintop has been awfully complicated. And all sorts of things have still been at work. And I think that the part of the answer to all of that is to understand the whole story of how we got to the mountaintop, how we got to the need to climb the mountain to begin with. And so that's the virtue of a book and a story like the one that I have written, is that I think that these events, the story of how slavery is resurrected after the Civil War, how it persists all the way to the 1940s and even into the 1950s to some degree, it persists in a way in American life that there are thousands and thousands of black Americans alive today, older black Americans, who experienced some version of slavery, who were born on a farm in South Georgia or in the Arkansas Delta, where they were born into a de facto state of slavery. As I have been out talking about this book, I can't tell you, in fact, I suspect this will happen today, whenever there are any African Americans in the audience, someone comes up to me afterwards and says, now I understand the story that my grandmother used to tell, or the story that my great-grandfather told my aunt before he died, the story of the farm in South Georgia that they couldn't leave until a brother came back at the end of World War II, and they all left in the middle of the night, and they'd never been paid by the white man the whole time they had to live on the place. I just can't tell you how many dozens of times those stories have been told to me, all stories that could have been a part of this book and that are so fundamentally a part of the American experience, and a part of the American experience that I think we completely fail to comprehend the magnitude of. Now, somebody in the room right now is already formulating a question for me that goes along these lines. Why would a white guy why would a white guy from the Mississippi Delta who works for Rupert Murdoch at the most conservative newspaper in America write this book? That's the question. And the answer to that, there are a lot of parts of that to that answer. But I am a child of the Mississippi Delta, born in Stuttgart, which is technically in the Delta, but I was born in Stuttgart and then raised on the Mississippi side of the river. But I was born in the fall of 1964, a few months after the murder of Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney in Philadelphia, Mississippi. I was then in our town, Leland, Mississippi. In 1965, the following spring, there was a farm labor strike on a plantation on the outskirts of town, where a group of African-American families, at the urging of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and Fannie Lou Hamer, walked off of a plantation. It was the first farm labor action of any kind in the South since the Depression, and was supposed to have been part of a huge strike all across the Delta. But on the day that the strike came, only this one group actually pulled it off and refused to go in the fields or to drive the tractors. And for a very short moment of time, they were sort of the civil rights incident of the week in 1965. And they got a little bit of national attention, but then for the most part, that incident disappeared from most of the recollection of that period of time. But the strikers, you know, what they had done in May of 1965, they would never be able to get away from. None of the men who were part of that strike were ever able to work again in the county that we lived in. They were evicted from their homes because they all lived in tenant homes on the plantation. They were evicted that day. forced off the plantation. They, for a short time, lived in a compound of tents on a piece of property owned by a black man who had a country store. And then later, secretly, Lucy Montgomery, who was a white woman who was the heir to the Montgomery Ward fortune and was one of the great untold stories of the Civil Rights era, was that she secretly funded a huge amount of the Civil Rights movement, and though almost no one knew that was happening at the time. And she bought a little piece of land nearby, and the strikers and their families moved there with some help from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and some other outside groups. They built some houses and lived there, and that place came to be known as Strike City, and it's still there. And in fact, the man who led that strike, John Henry Sylvester, died just a few months ago, and so there's still a few of the original strikers out there. So that's 1965. Then in 1968, a group of black high school students in my town staged a march, a peaceful march, where they marched from the black high school to the white high school across town to protest that the schools were still completely segregated for all intents and purposes 13 years after the, I can't do my math, long after the Brown decision. And after they arrived at the white high school, the redneck police chief of this little town of about 10,000 people started firing tear gas at them indiscriminately. And so a melee broke open. And this was not a town, in most respects, this was a fairly, I was saying to the students earlier that it's not right to say that this was a more tolerant town, but it would be right to say it was a less malevolent town, as Mississippi towns went. But so these kids get tear gassed, and a melee ensues, and there are people running around town, and there are fist fights breaking out, windows being broken, and at one point, a 16-year-old black boy burst through the door of a feed and seed store on the edge of town, and the white man behind the counter pulls a pistol out and shoots him in the doorway. The kid survives, but there's never an investigation into the case, and the man who shot the kid is never prosecuted. So that's 1968. Then in October of 1969, the U.S. Supreme Court ordered that the schools in our town and about 30 other districts in Mississippi be immediately integrated. All resistance was to cease. It's a very, very important decision because all across the South, it finally led to the actual integration of hundreds of schools, but our town was one of those specifically named in the order. And so at Christmas of 1969, the schools close, and then they reopen after the Christmas break, fully integrated. And then in the fall of 1970, I began the first grade. And so I was in that first class of children in Mississippi who began the first grade together, black and white, and then that group went through 12 grades of public education integrated together. Now, our town was fairly remarkable, in part because of the work of people like my mother, who's here, Sarah Blackmon, because in this little town, for various reasons, there was a little constituency of whites who, even though they were somewhat oblivious to what African Americans were thinking at the time, but in their own way, there was this group of more moderate whites who fundamentally realized that this was a moment that they had to step forward and do what they perceived to be in that moment the right thing. Now, they were mostly Southerners. They were mostly mildly racist, like all white people in the South were. Even the goodest good whites in 1969 were still at least mildly racist. But they stepped forward to try to do the right thing as they understood it at that time, because they fundamentally understood that a small town needed public schools, that a small town would die without vibrant public schools. And so they began a Think Positive campaign, began urging other whites to keep the children in the public schools. And when the schools opened, and with me in the first grade, there was still a meaningful constituency of whites in the school system, so that my schools were about 75% black, 25% white. That was an extraordinary achievement for a little town in the Mississippi Delta, to not have 99% black schools. Now, so I began the first grade in that circumstance in 1970. Fast forward a few years to the 7th grade, and the County Historical Society has an essay contest to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the county, open to any students in the county. And so I write an essay that year about Strike City, the civil rights incident back from 1965. Now, I still don't really know why I did that, or how I even knew about Strike City. My mother insists that it's because I went to school. There were Strike City kids who were in school with me when I started the first grade. But by and large, I was oblivious to all of these things that were happening, obviously, when I was 1 and 2 and 4 and 5 years old. But for whatever the case, by the time in the 7th grade, I've become aware of Strike City, and I write this little naive essay about it. And in my, in my sort of 11-year-old mind, I thought, even though I went out and talked to the plantation owner, and I still had this idea that everybody was dead who was in the story, even though I had talked to one of them, and that all of this was so far in the past that that nobody could possibly be still be up in arms about any of this, even though it was only 11 or 12 years after the event had occurred. But so I write this little essay, and I talk to the plantation owner. Like most white people do, I don't think I talked to any of the black people in the story. I just went out and talked to the white people. But then I wrote this little essay about it and submitted that. And a few weeks later, an envelope arrives at the house that has my name typed on the outside of it. It's an unusual event for an 11-year-old in those days. Open this thing up, and it's a letter from the Historical Society that says that I've won 2nd place in the essay contest. And I'm supposed to go to be at the county fair on a certain day, a certain place, to pick up my certificate, and that Mrs. Smith or something would be at that place wearing a blue dress, and I should go there and look for her in a blue dress. And so my mother drops me off at the county fair. Would never do that today with an 11-year-old. I make my way to the designated location, and there's a white lady there in a blue dress. But I'm too timid to walk up and say, I'm Doug Blackmon, because that might not be her, and I would be embarrassed. And so I stand there, waiting for her to notice me, certain that she will figure out that I am Doug Blackmon. I wait for a while, and she looks at me several times, no hint of recognition. And then finally I see another little white boy walk up, who I knew through church camp circles, but who went to one of the SAG academies, one of the all-white SAG academies that had popped up in a nearby town at the time of integration. But I knew this kid, and he walks up, and she immediately recognizes him, and they break into conversation about the contest and the award. So, okay, that's her. I finally walk up and introduce myself. And I don't know if I realized it at that exact moment or later, but she looked at me, and there was this expression on her face, and I eventually figured out that by virtue of the topic of my essay, the fact that I went to a black school, the oddity of my name, I was supposed to have been the colored boy getting a certificate that day. And so I have always considered myself an early beneficiary of affirmative action. But so then the next year, the town oratorical contest came around. And I decided to give a speech based on my award-winning essay of the previous year. And so I put together this speech about Strike City and that incident. And I still was sort of under the impression that this was something that nobody would really care about anymore. This was just an interesting historical thing and a very uplifting story. And so I wrote this speech about Strike City, and I gave it in the first rounds of the contest, and I won at the junior high school level. And the finals of the contest were before the Lions Club, because the Lions Club sponsored the oratorical contest. And so I and the 2 high school winners went down, and interesting enough, I think the other finalists were both black. But we go down, and they were great, the others, and they gave these really inspirational, motivational kinds of talks, and they were terrific. I was really outclassed, and they were much older than me. But then I got up and I gave my speech about Strike City, and immediately, as I started, I knew something was wrong. I didn't know what was wrong, but I knew something was wrong, because I'm talking to 35 middle-aged white guys, and so I started going through the speech, and they kind of snicker in the wrong places, and when I make reference to little black towns and little black settlements, they would find something funny about that and would snicker about it. And then when I got to the part about how the strikers weathered attacks by the Ku Klux Klan and persevered, and they didn't get aroused by that in any kind of way or anything, And so, of course, it had never occurred to me that I was giving my speech to the Ku Klux Klansmen who had attacked the strikers. But later I figured that out. But then afterwards there was a receiving line. I didn't win, by the way. But then afterwards there was sort of a receiving line, and and all the gentlemen came by and shook our hands and told us what good jobs we did. But there was this one guy who was holding back to the very end, and he came up to me last. This guy who, by my recollection of it, he was about 8 feet tall and 100 years old and has a crazy mop of white hair, but that's because I was 12. He's probably about my age and looked about like me now. But he came up to me and began to berate me, just berating me. You know, where did you get all that? You know, where did you find that, boy? You know, where did you come up with all that? Those are lies, lies. And, you know, again, that was, to me, was just sort of more awkward adult behavior, weird adult behavior, is how I took it at the time. But, and I tried to answer his questions, and he would just really sort of out of control. And finally, my English teacher, who was sort of my sponsor, kind of wedged herself between us because she was afraid he was actually going to hit me. And then that sort of ended the incident, and he went away. A few weeks later, I got another letter in the mail with my name typed on the outside. And this time it was a very formal apology from the president of the Lions Club, which again was just baffling adult behavior to me. I mean, just none of it made any sense to me. But I did notice that the next year there was no Lions Club oratorical contest. Never had one again after that. Many years later, I went back to Leland. In fact, some of what I've just been telling you is my next book is sort of a memoir of those events in that period of time. And so I've gone back and tried to reconstruct a lot of what happened in that period that I was too young to understand and to figure out some of my own memories from that time. But years later, I learned that the guy who berated me that day was the man who shot the 16-year-old boy back in 1968. And some years after that, I wrote an essay that appeared in Harper's about 15 years ago now. It's terrible to confess that, and then I still haven't finished that project. I wrote an essay about those events and the integration of the schools in my town, and it's really the basis of the next book. But I went back and reported out all this stuff and sort of reconstructed those events, and I wrote this piece about all of that. Because in the end, what also ultimately happened in that town, and what my next book explores, is how, in the end, all of the good work by good whites and African Americans who stepped forward and tried to make something different happen in that town in the 70s and the 80s, in the end, it didn't work. You know, it didn't work. There wasn't enough public service. You know, things came apart, and it was just too hard, and it really didn't work. And so now, if you go to that town, the schools are 100% black, just like every other poor town in the Mississippi Delta. And so one of the dilemmas we face as Americans is to figure out why that happens too often. That even when good public servants try to do good public service, that we often don't have the longevity and the energy and the creativity that we need to make things actually work. I mean, I think we've seen some of that over the past year in terms of there was enough energy to get President Obama elected president, but there doesn't seem to have been enough energy to sustain him in the way that he probably should have been sustained by his political base. But so I wrote this piece that sort of explored some of those questions all these years ago, and a version of it first appeared in the Atlanta Constitution, where I worked at that time. And after the story ran, a letter arrived to the editor of the Constitution from the man who had been the mayor of my hometown through almost all of those years that I'm describing. And in his letter to the editor, he said that no one in Leland, Mississippi could remember any of those events having ever occurred. So I've long had this acute sense that there are many things that we as Americans choose not to remember, have chosen not to remember. And it is very much so that we have chosen not to remember these things. But I'm equally convinced that we have to remember all of these things, because this is also not a story of black history. This book is not black history. It's also not a polemical to argue that all white people in America, it's not just a history of the bad things white people did and an argument for how all white people should now walk around humped over with a big basket of guilt on their shoulders at all time. That's not the message of the book or the history that it tells. This is a story of American history. It is a story of things done by Americans to Americans. And if we believe in an ideal of America that we say we believe, then we have to be able to be honest about the past, to confront the most difficult aspects of the past, to come to terms with the enormity of what was really done, not just the difficulty that African Americans faced at the beginning of the 20th century, but the width and breadth and enormity of the venality that was perpetrated against African Americans in such a deliberate way, and in ways that we very much so still live with the consequences of today. And so if we're honest about our ideals as a nation, then we have to be honest about the past, and it's the only way we'll ever have a true shared vision of the future, a shared vision of what our country should be, and a shared vision of the place that a few months ago we all thought we were getting a little closer to. So let me close with one last thought, actually expressed by a reader of the book who said it better than me. But this was not long after the book came out. I got an email out of the blue from a woman I've never met, a school teacher somewhere out in the Midwest. And she had heard me on NPR, I think, and then had seen an excerpt of the book that appeared in the Wall Street Journal, and then she went to the website for the book, which I'd encourage all of you to do too, and read more about it. And this woman she'd read one of the excerpts that appeared in the journal was about Atlanta. There's a chapter on Atlanta that talks about that brick factory I described. That brick factory was started and owned by the man who was really the father of modern Atlanta. He had been the mayor of the city in the 1880s. He was responsible for Atlanta becoming the state capital of Georgia. He was the wealthiest man in Atlanta, probably one of the wealthiest people in America in the early 20th century. He started a bank which ultimately became a part of the late Wachovia. But in those days was the biggest and most powerful bank in the South. So he was an incredibly powerful man. That was the brick company guy. His biggest rival in business in Atlanta at that time was a fellow named Joel Hurt. And Joel Hurt was also an incredibly successful early 20th century businessman, became incredibly rich, started several banks that are still with us today, had a hand in the 1919 creation of the modern Coca-Cola company. He started the company that became Southern Company, which all of the Mississippi Power and Light, I think Arkansas Power and Light, but a lot of the power companies across the South are all derivatives of a company that he started back in 1903. Incredibly wealthy guy. But all of his initial wealth, his initial fortune, came from coal mines and iron ore mines and timber camps that he also owned that were all worked by these slave laborers of the type that I talk about. And he, more so than any character in the book, he was a sadistic, evil man. Sometimes I try to be as giving and generous as I can to these historical characters, but he was a man who was absolutely sadistic and demanded a kind of sadism in the labor camps that he owned that's really sort of hard to imagine today. But so soon after the book came out, this email arrived. Dear Mr. Blackmon, I'm the great-great-granddaughter of Joel Hurt. I've only just discovered your book. I've found everything possible about it on the web, including your website. I'm trying to muster the courage to read it. Just reading excerpts has been quite painful. Needless to say, this is a very emotional subject for us, as we did not know any of this before. But in the meantime, I'm writing because I want to thank you simply for having written it. I've had that same photo of great-great-grandfather hanging on my wall for years, and have always been proud of his participation in rebuilding Atlanta after the Civil War. But I believe that the ghosts of slavery and racism and the terrorism inflicted within our own country must not be hidden away, but brought out into the open. I am so grateful to you for allowing me to learn more of the truth of my family's past. Without the whole truth, we live only in illusions. And I would hate to live my life perpetuating illusions, especially such horrific ones whose ramifications continue today. I remain proud of where I come from, but humbled by the realities that you brought to light. I thank that reader for her vote of confidence and the integrity of her heart, and I thank all of you for listening to me today. Thank you.
We did run a little bit over time. I know many of you have to go to back to work at the lunch hour. We're going to have time for just two quick questions, and then we're going to sign some books. And Alejandro?
Thank you. Alejandro Aviles, student here at the Clinton School. The Southern Poverty Law Center has talked about another form of slavery, which is within the immigrant community. And I know Georgia's has a growing immigrant population. I was wondering if you thought there was a parity within these two, the coercion of oppression through the criminal justice system, as you said, and what can we do to maybe have the lions of the civil rights movement recognize that this is another plight, if you agree with that?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. One thing I'll say is that the more I study history, the more I try to understand things, the more amazed I am at how repetitive humans are in the ways that we treat each other badly. And we do the same things over and over again, over the centuries. And so it's absolutely the case that there are a lot of the mechanisms that I talk about in the book are mechanisms that you can find today. This kind of debt slavery in particular, where you charge a laborer for their transportation to where they're going to work or the food they're going to eat, and then you basically hold them as prisoners until they pay the money back, and you keep adding new charges on so that they never can pay you back, and hold them forever and physically abuse them. And I mean that mechanism of coercion repeats itself again and again and again, and we see it now in immigrant labor camps in many places. It's not another thing I'm often asked about, you didn't, but that relates to this is whether the current sort of prison industrial complex, the private prisons and the use of prison labor today, whether that's an extension, in a sense, of what I write about in the book. And neither of those are an extension in the sense of that the people who were doing this, begat the people who are doing it today exactly. There's not that kind of linear extension of these things. But certainly, slavery by another name is the story of how America became conditioned to the idea that it was normal for there to be a gigantic population of African American men in particular who were under the control of the state for the purposes of labor perpetually. That's how we came to be comfortable with this and to not find it outrageous. Even when white Americans, or many black Americans for that matter, would encounter this reality of how many African Americans were being incarcerated and then used for labor in many ways, and to not find that outrageous or not find that sort of abnormal. This is how we got in that habit, got institutionalized to that habit. And I think there's also an aspect of that applies to what you were asking about. But in terms of the present day, I'm a lot more expert on what happened in the past than I am necessarily in the present. But yes, obviously, an alliance between those who are still victimized by aspects of this or the ramifications of this, and then those sorts of people who are presently experiencing things very similar to this. Obviously, there should be an alliance of those. There should be an alliance of those who speak on their behalf. At the same time, I'll also say, though, in deference to the victims that I talk about in the book, because I feel sort of sensitive to it, they did experience a level of brutality and sort of apocalyptic treatment that thankfully is not happening today. And it's important to acknowledge that too.
Last question, Annie, keep it short.
I'm the Helen Thomas of school.
Hello, Helen.
My question is that the reference to the immigration and the reference to the prison complex as the new plantation, do you feel from a historical standpoint that we will ever have reparation for America to have that flushing from our system, oppressing of other people?
Yeah, if you didn't all hear it, fundamentally the question is sort of will we ever have reparations, but also more generally, can we given how the connection of all this to the present, will there ever be reparations of any kind, to sort of flesh this out? I don't know the answer to that exactly. And I say in the epilogue of the book, I take a dodge. I get asked about the reparations question always, and I artfully dodge it in the epilogue in a cynical effort to sell more books. No, but I dodge it. What I say in the epilogue is that the book is neither an argument for reparations or against it, financial reparations. But it's not completely a dodge, because as I was saying before, what I'm really about, this is a book of history. It's not a polemical, but I'm talking today much more as an advocate for a way of interpreting this book, much more so than the book does. But what this is about is honesty, and it sounds Pollyanna-ish perhaps, or Kumbaya-ish or something, but nonetheless. You cannot enter into a transaction with any person if you are not in good faith and they are not in good faith. And the conversation about how to deal with the consequences of our past is one that has never yet occurred fully in good faith on both sides. Because good faith demands honesty about what has come before. And we have yet to be able to be completely honest about all of these events. And in the epilogue of the book, I describe, in fact, a dialogue. The epilogue is made up of a series of dialogues between me and living people who connect to these events somehow. One of them was the then CEO of Wachovia Bank, which is a descendant of this bank started by the guy with the brick factory. And Wachovia was one of the banks that back during the sort of the height of the slavery reparations discussion back in '99 and 2000, when that had its biggest potency, the city of Chicago passed an ordinance that said that any company doing business with the city of Chicago had to do a disclosure of any ties it had to antebellum slavery. It was a gimmick of sorts, just to sort of force the issue at times. And it really only had much impact on banks, because there really aren't any corporations that go back to the antebellum era except banks. There really there aren't any railroads, there's hardly any land holdings, and there really is very little connectivity between then and now in terms of corporate institutions, even though corporations can live forever. And the fact that a corporation can live forever creates an interesting sort of question about the burden of the past. When we die, our burdens disappear with us, and our children really don't necessarily inherit them. But a company never has to die. And banks never die. No bank ever dies. It gets swallowed by another bank, but it never, ever dies. As even in the last few months, none of these banks have gone away. They've just been consumed by other banks. And so when the city of Chicago did this, Wachovia Bank did a lot of business with Chicago, and so they were going to have to do this disclosure. Well, the CEO of Wachovia at the time, Ken Thompson, very nice guy, a few years older than me, North Carolina raised guy who went to college with, he would have experienced integration probably while he was in high school and then gone to college with black students, believes all the things he's supposed to believe, sincere about them, has all the right, compassionate conservative principles, that you would expect him to have, and sincere about all that. Well, this thing comes up. Well, Wachovia didn't even exist. The bank called Wachovia didn't exist before the Civil War. It was created in the 1870s, the 1880s. So his first reaction was, we have to do what? We have to do a study on our connections to slavery when we didn't even exist, at that time? And specifically he said, this is some Jesse Jackson stunt. That was his first response to it. We're not going to do it. But then he was prevailed on by other people that, no, we have to do it, and let's just go through it, and maybe some good will come of it. So long story short, they end up hiring a big team of historians, independent historians, to do this research. And of course, once you start something like that, you have to do it very well, because somebody like me will come along and point out that you left out a bunch of stuff if you don't do it well. And so they begin this process, hire these historians, and a few months later they come back with this report. And of course, it turns out that Wachovia has connections to slavery all over the place, because they'd consumed all these banks over time as they became a giant bank, and those banks had all sorts of connections, mostly northern banks in the north. that had financed the construction of slave ships, had financed the purchase of slaves, had sold insurance on slaves, all sorts of connections into slavery. Because, and again, another reflection of the degree to which that slavery was the biggest industry in America until the end of the Civil War. And everybody in America had a piece of the slavery action in one way or another, which is another reason why whenever a white person in the South says to you, well, why do I have to care about this? My people didn't own any slaves. It's like, you know, that's the biggest nonsense in the world, a completely irrelevant question. That's the thing. But so Wachovia goes through this process. Ken Thompson, you know, discovers all this stuff. He's shocked to learn it. But then what to do with it? What do we do with this incredible information that we have to disclose? And so the first thing Wachovia did was what every white company does when it has a race problem. It started a scholarship fund for, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. But then they decided, okay, now we have to disclose all this. And so they decided to release this to a meeting of, there's an organization of African American employees of Wachovia. And so they bring together one of these groups of African American employees, and the CEO himself, you know, goes to the meeting and sort of makes a speech, announces the scholarship fund, and then presents the findings. And going into that meeting, he expected absolute disaster. You know, every expectation was this would be disaster. He was going to be attacked. There were going to be lawsuits. You know, mass disaffection among all the black employees. I mean, he just viewed it as a just nightmare of what was going to follow this. And instead, he discloses the results, and instead of that reaction, people start crying in the room. You know, people walk up to him and embrace him. You know, he's emotional about it. And again, this all sounds kind of Pollyanna-ish, kind of kumbaya. There's got to be something nice in the book, though. But I treat it as real, because what happened was a moment of honesty in which people who thought they talked to each other, but really never had talked to each other, found a way to communicate about some very important things. Now, whether they lost the moment the minute they walked out the door, that's possible. But nonetheless, the temperature in the room, the dynamic between blacks and whites in that place and in that time was changed by an act of real honesty, of absolute honesty. And for me, that's what is the first step toward whatever the repair is we have to be honest about the injury. And then the mechanisms of repair, well, they're complicated. But I think a big dose of honesty is what comes first. Thank you very much.